She felt his whiskey-soaked lips crash against hers, a kiss she never asked for. But what made every man on that porch go silent was the blade she pressed against his ribs. "Next time you touch me," she whispered, "I'll cut you into a dress pattern." She was running from a dead father's secret, carrying a ledger that could destroy a powerful man. And the only person willing to stand beside her was a mountain stranger with scars on his wrists and blood on his conscience. This is a story where trust is more dangerous than any bullet. Welcome to Cowboy Dusk, where the Old West comes alive through stories of love found on dusty trails, courage born from heartbreak, and the quiet kindness between souls who refuse to give up on each other. This story reminds us that real love isn't about rescuing someone. It's about standing beside them, scars and all, and choosing to stay when walking away would be easier. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Cowboy Dusk and hit that bell so you need never miss a story worth staying for. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience.
The stolen kiss tasted like whiskey and arrogance. But what made Margaret Vance truly tremble was not the cowboy's mouth pressed hard against hers. It was her own hand tightening around the handle of the cutting knife hidden in her apron pocket. Leavenworth, Kansas, sat perched on the western edge of Missouri River country like a town that could not decide whether it wanted to be civilized or wild. In the summer of 1872, the streets were packed with soldiers from the nearby fort, traders bound for Santa Fe, miners chasing gold dreams into the mountains, and all manner of frontier folk whose stories were written in the dust on their boots, and the lines carved deep into their sun-weathered faces. Margaret Vance had been among them for 3 months now. 3 months of honest work behind the counter of Henderson's dress shop on Delaware Street. 3 months of keeping her head down and her secrets tucked away in the lining of a worn carpet bag. She was walking home that Tuesday afternoon, her basket heavy with bolts of calico and spools of thread, when Jim Bradley stepped off the saloon porch and into her path. She saw him coming. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a cattleman's hat tilted at an angle that said he thought highly of himself and expected the world to agree. His friends lounged on the porch behind him, 5 or 6 ranch hands passing a bottle and watching with the lazy interest of men looking for entertainment on a hot afternoon. One of them hollered something Margaret did not catch. Jim grinned back at them, then turned to face her with that grin still plastered across his sun-browned face. He was handsome in the way that men who have never been denied anything tend to be. Confident jaw, easy smile, eyes that said the world was his and everyone in it was just visiting. Margaret stepped to the side to pass him. Jim stepped with her. "Afternoon, miss," he said. His voice carried the slow drawl of a man raised on cattle money and good bourbon. "You are about the prettiest thing I have seen walk down Delaware Street in a long while." Margaret did not answer. She shifted her basket to her other arm and tried to go around him. Jim moved again, blocking her path. His friends were watching now, leaning forward on the porch rail. One of them whistled low. "Come on, Jim," one called out. "You going to talk all day, or are you going to show the lady some proper Kansas hospitality?" Something shifted in Jim's eyes. A dare accepted. A performance begun. Before Margaret could draw breath to protest, he seized her waist with one hand, pulled her close, and pressed his whiskey-soaked lips against hers. The kiss lasted maybe 2 seconds. Margaret's hand found the knife before the first second was over. She pulled the small seamstress blade from her apron pocket and pressed the sharp point against the soft spot between Jim's ribs just above his belt. Not hard enough to draw blood. Hard enough to make her meaning clear as creek water. Jim went rigid. His mouth broke away from hers. He looked down and saw the blade. "Next time you touch me," Margaret said, her voice low and steady despite the trembling in her fingers, "I will cut you into a dress pattern." Jim's friends erupted. Laughter, hooting, the slapping of thighs. One of them nearly fell off the porch rail. But Jim was not laughing. He was staring at the knife against his ribs, and something moved across his face that was not fear exactly, but was close enough to be its cousin. He released her waist and stepped back, raised both hands in a gesture of surrender that was only half mocking. "A girl who knows her way around a blade," he said. His voice had changed. The swagger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Interest. Real interest. The kind that does not go away when the laughter stops. "I like that." Margaret lowered the knife but did not put it away. She held Jim Bradley's gaze for a long moment, then walked past him without another word. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked with the measured stride of a woman who refused to let any man see her afraid, even when her heart was slamming against her ribs like a fist on a locked door. Behind her, she heard Jim's voice, pitched to Carrie. "I am not a man who gives up easy, miss whoever you are." Margaret kept walking. Across the street, standing in the shade of the general store awning, a man watched the entire scene unfold. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that looked like they had been hewn from the same timber that built the buildings around him. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar in waves that had never known a barber's attention. A thick beard covered his jaw, and his skin was weathered to the color of saddle leather from years spent above the tree line where the sun hit harder and the wind never stopped. His name was Ashton Vale, and he had come down from the Rocky Mountains 3 days ago to sell beaver pelts and buy supplies. He did this once, sometimes twice a year. It was the only time he walked among people, and he counted the hours until he could leave. He had watched the cowboy grab the girl. He had watched the girl pull a knife. He had watched her hold it steady against the cowboy's ribs while her hand shook and her eyes did not. He did not intervene. She had not needed him to. But something about the scene snagged in his chest like a fishhook. The way she trembled but did not retreat. The way her voice stayed level while her knuckles went white around the blade. Ashton knew what courage looked like when it was wrapped around fear. He had worn that particular armor himself for most of his 30 years. He recognized the cowboy. Jim Bradley, only son of Howard Bradley, who owned the biggest cattle operation south of Leavenworth and half the commercial property in town besides. Ashton also knew that Howard Bradley had recently taken on a business partner from St. Louis, a man named Holloway whose name kept surfacing in saloon conversations like a dead fish floating to the top of a still pond. None of it was Ashton's concern. He had pelts to sell and flour to buy and a long ride back to his cabin in the high country, where the only voices were wind and water, and the occasional elk bugling across the valley at dawn. He turned away from the scene on the street and went back to haggling with the merchant over the price of beaver skins. But the image stayed with him. The girl with the knife, the shake in her hand, the steel in her eyes. That evening, Margaret climbed the narrow stairs to her room at Callahan's boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure run by a widow in her 50s who maintained strict rules about curfews and propriety. The room was small, a bed, a washstand, a trunk, and a window that looked out over the street below. Margaret set down her basket and went straight to the carpet bag she kept tucked under the bed. It was a compulsive habit, the way someone who has lost everything checks to make sure they still have something. She opened the clasp, ran her fingers along the lining where the leather-bound ledger was hidden, and felt the familiar shape of it pressed flat against the fabric. Then she stopped. The clasp. Margaret always latched the carpet bag with the brass facing left. She had done it the same way every single day since she fled St. Louis. It was the kind of small ritual that kept a person sane when everything else had gone sideways. Tonight, the clasp faced right. She stared at it for a long time, told herself she was imagining things, that she had simply been careless this morning in her rush to get to the shop. But Margaret Vance was never careless. Careless was a luxury for people who had not lost everything once already. Someone had been in her room. And the only time she had been distracted enough for anyone to slip past Mrs. Callahan's watchful eye was the exact moment a cowboy's lips were pressed against hers. The next morning, Margaret found a wildflower on the shop doorstep. No note. She threw it away without a second thought, then thought about it for the rest of the morning. Henderson's dress shop occupied a corner building on Delaware Street, with large front windows that displayed the latest fashions imported from back east. The shop smelled of new fabric and lavender sachets, and the morning light fell across the cutting table in warm gold bars that made the bolts of silk and calico glow like something from a painting. Mrs. Della Henderson had built the business from nothing after her husband died in '68, and she ran it with the sharp eye and sharper tongue of a woman who had survived too much to suffer fools. She was waiting when Margaret unlocked the front door. "Heard about yesterday," Mrs. Henderson said, not looking up from the wedding dress she was hand-stitching at the back table. Her reading glasses sat on the end of her nose, and her silver-streaked hair was pinned up in a style that had been fashionable 20 years ago and would probably be fashionable 20 years hence. Margaret set down her basket and began straightening bolts of fabric on the display shelf. It was nothing. Some cowboy being foolish. Jim Bradley is not just some cowboy, dear. Mrs. Henderson's needlework did not slow. His father owns half this town. The other half owes him favors. You be careful with that family. Howard Bradley is not a man accustomed to hearing the word no, neither is his son. Before Margaret could respond, the door chime rang and Jim Bradley himself walked in, hat in his hands. He looked different in the morning light, less swaggering, more uncertain. He wore a clean shirt and had combed his hair, and in his free hand he carried a silk handkerchief that looked like it cost more than Margaret earned in a week. "Miss Vance," he began. He had learned her name overnight. That meant he had been asking about her. "I came to apologize for yesterday. I was out of line, and I know it." He held out the handkerchief. Pale blue silk, imported, with delicate embroidery along the edges. It was not so much an apology as an opening bid. Margaret looked at the handkerchief and then at the man holding it. Part of her wanted to accept both and move on with her day. A larger part remembered the taste of whiskey and the feel of hands on her waist that had not been invited. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Bradley, but a silk handkerchief does not undo what happened. Then let me make it right. Dinner, tonight, the Planters Hotel, best food in Leavenworth." Jim's smile was practiced and persuasive, and full of the confidence of a man who had never been turned down for anything in his 25 years. "No." The word hung in the air between them. Jim blinked. Then his smile returned, smaller but more genuine. "I am not a man who gives up easy, Miss Vance. You will find that out about me soon enough." He set the handkerchief on the counter, tipped his hat, and walked out. The door chime rang behind him like a small bell marking the end of a round in a fight that was clearly not over. Mrs. Henderson looked up from her stitching. "That boy is trouble dressed in good boots." "I can handle trouble." "I know you can, dear. That is what worries me. The trouble you cannot handle is the kind that comes wearing a smile." The door chimed again less than a minute later, and the man who walked in made the shop feel suddenly smaller. Ashton Vale had to duck slightly to clear the door frame, and when he straightened to his full height inside, the bolts of fabric on the display shelf barely reached his chest. He wore buckskin trousers and a cotton shirt that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original cloth, and he carried a worn leather coat draped over one arm. "Morning," he said. His voice was deep and quiet, the kind of voice that belonged to open spaces and high places where shouting was unnecessary. "I need this coat repaired. Seam is coming apart at the shoulder." Margaret took the coat and examined it with the automatic precision of someone who had been reading fabric since childhood. The stitching was hand-done. Heavy thread, uneven gauge, the work of someone with large hands and no formal training but considerable patience. The man mended his own clothes in the wilderness and did a fair job of it. The leather was worn soft from years of use and smelled faintly of wood smoke and pine. She also noticed, when he extended his arm to hand her the coat, a network of old scars circling both wrists. Rope scars, not the kind a ranch hand got from working cattle. These were the marks left by binding. Someone had tied this man's wrists tight enough to scar, and it had happened more than once. She filed the observation away without comment. "I can have this ready by Thursday," she said. What size shirt do you wear? I will need to adjust the shoulder seam to fit. Big, Ashton said. Margaret looked up at him. I need a number, Mr. Vale, not an adjective. Something happened to his face. The hard line of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, as if the muscles had forgotten the motion and were trying to remember. Fair enough, he said. And for just a moment, standing in the morning light of the dress shop with fabric dust floating between them like gold flecks, Margaret felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Curiosity. Not the wary kind that kept her alive. The other kind. The dangerous kind. She measured him quickly and efficiently, noting dimensions in her ledger with the same precision she brought to everything. 52-inch chest, 20-inch shoulders, arms long enough that most ready-made shirts would leave his wrists bare by 3 inches. He stood still while she worked, patient as a tree, and when she circled him with the measuring tape, she caught the faint scent of wood smoke and something else underneath it. Cedar, maybe, or juniper. Thursday, she said again, stepping back. Thursday, he agreed. He took the receipt she handed him, their fingers not quite touching, and then he was gone, ducking back through the doorframe and out onto Delaware Street, where the morning sun swallowed his broad silhouette whole. Mrs. Henderson had not looked up from her stitching during the entire exchange, but now she peered over her glasses with an expression that was equal parts amusement and calculation. That man has been in town 3 days and has visited this shop twice. Yesterday he bought 4 handkerchiefs and a spool of thread. Today he brings a coat. She paused. Either he is outfitting a regiment or he has found an excuse to stand in my shop and stare at you. He was not staring. Honey, I have been reading men since before you were born. That man was staring. Margaret busied herself with the coat and did not respond. But she noticed, as she turned the leather over in her hands, that the lining had been repaired with a stitch pattern she had never seen before. Tight, looping, almost decorative. The kind of work done by someone who had spent a great deal of time alone with a needle and nothing but patience to keep him company. After leaving the shop, Ashton did not go back to his rented room at the boarding house across town. He went to the saloon. Not to drink. To listen. He ordered a beer he did not intend to finish and took a seat near the back wall where he could see the door and both windows. The saloon was half empty at this hour, just a few regulars nursing morning whiskey and a card game in the corner that had likely been running all night. The bartender was a talkative man named Dutch, who had a memory for faces and a weakness for gossip. Ashton had bought enough drinks over the years to have earned a measure of trust with him. That fellow Harden who came in last week, Ashton said, keeping his voice casual. He's still around? Cleet Harden? Dutch wiped a glass and set it on the shelf. Sure is. Been asking questions all over town, looking for some girl from St. Louis. Says she owes a debt to his employer. Dutch shrugged. Could be true. Could be trouble. With a man like Cleet, hard to tell the difference. Ashton's blood went cold in his veins, though his face showed nothing. He knew Cleet Harden, knew him the way a man knows his own shadow on a bad day. They had ridden together briefly 5 years back when Ashton was still working as a bounty hunter and Cleet was doing the same. Cleet was cold and professional and efficient in the way that a well-oiled pistol is efficient. He did not enjoy violence, but he did not avoid it either. He viewed everything in the world as a transaction, and the currency he dealt in was fear. If Cleet was in Leavenworth looking for a young woman from St. Louis, it was not about a debt. It was about something someone powerful wanted back. And the only young woman from St. Louis that Ashton knew of in this town was the girl with the cutting knife and the sharp tongue who had just measured him for a coat repair, with hands that smelled like lavender and new cotton. Ashton finished his beer slowly. Then he stood, left the saloon, and walked to the boarding house where he was staying. He had planned to leave in the morning, pack his mule, point it west, and climb back into the silence where he belonged. That was the rhythm. That was the penance. Instead, he paid Mrs. Callahan for another week. Margaret realized she was in trouble on Tuesday afternoon. Not because of the cowboy who kept courting her or the dangerous stranger who had apparently come to town asking questions about a woman from St. Louis. She was in trouble because she had started inventing reasons for the mountain man to come back to the dress shop. This was unacceptable. Margaret Vance did not invent reasons for men to visit her. Margaret Vance kept men at arm's length with a sharp tongue and sharper scissors, and she liked it that way. Men were unreliable. Men hid things. Men smiled at you over breakfast while gambling away your mother's jewelry and your family's good name, and then one morning you found them dead in the study with a pistol in their hand and a note that explained nothing. At least that was the story Margaret had been telling herself for 2 years. The truth, as she was beginning to discover, might be something else entirely, but she was not ready for that yet. The week unfolded in a pattern that would have been comical if it were not so transparent. Jim Bradley appeared outside the shop every morning with flowers. Monday it was daisies. Tuesday it was wildflowers tied with a ribbon. Wednesday it was a small bouquet of roses that must have cost more than most ranch hands earned in a day. He never came inside again after the silk handkerchief incident. He simply left the flowers on the doorstep, tipped his hat toward the window, and walked away. It was courtship conducted at a respectful distance, which was somehow more unsettling than the aggressive pursuit Margaret had expected. Mrs. Henderson watched the daily flower deliveries with growing concern. Howard Bradley does not invest in anything without expecting a return, she told Margaret one quiet afternoon while they worked on a gown for the mayor's wife. That includes his son's affections. If Jim is pursuing you this hard, it is because Howard has given his blessing, and Howard's blessings always come with strings. Meanwhile, Ashton Vale found increasingly implausible excuses to visit the shop. He bought handkerchiefs on Thursday, suspenders on Friday. On Saturday, he came in asking if Margaret could recommend a good seamstress to repair a tear in his spare shirt, which was an impressive feat of circular logic given that Margaret was literally the seamstress standing in front of him. Mrs. Henderson observed from behind her stitching with the dry amusement of a woman who had spent 30 years watching men make fools of themselves. "That mountain man has purchased more sewing supplies than a military quartermaster," she said after Ashton's 4th visit. "Either he is outfitting an expedition to the North Pole, or he is sweet on you and lacks the vocabulary to say so." "He is not sweet on me," Margaret said, though she felt her cheeks warm despite herself. "He is just a customer." "Honey, that man has spent more money on buttons this week than most men spend on whiskey in a month. He is not shopping. He is building a bridge plank by plank and hoping you will meet him in the middle." On Saturday evening, Ashton finally abandoned the pretense. He appeared at the shop just before closing time and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking more uncomfortable than Margaret had ever seen a man that size look. "Miss Vance," he said, "I was wondering if you might join me for supper at the Planters Hotel. Nothing improper, just a meal in the dining room where half the town can see we are being respectable." Margaret should have said no. Every instinct built by 2 years of running and hiding told her to say no. She barely knew this man. She did not trust men in general, and large, quiet ones with rope scars on their wrists in particular. She said yes. The Planters Hotel dining room was the closest thing Leavenworth had to a fine establishment. White tablecloths, real china plates instead of tin, a chandelier made of elk antlers that someone had apparently dragged down from the mountains and hung from the ceiling with more ambition than taste. Ashton held Margaret's chair for her before taking his own seat, and she noticed that he moved with surprising grace for a man his size. He navigated the crowded dining room the way she imagined he navigated a forest, aware of every obstacle, every other body, every shift in the air. They ordered roast chicken and potatoes, and then the conversation began. It started politely enough. Ashton asked about her work at the dress shop. Margaret asked about his life in the mountains. But somewhere between the potatoes and the pie, the politeness caught fire and burned to the ground. It started when Ashton mentioned that the frontier was no place for a woman alone. He said it casually, without malice, the way a man might observe that water is wet. But something about the phrase "a woman alone" struck Margaret like a match on dry tinder. "The frontier is no place for a woman alone," she repeated, her voice cooling by several degrees. And I suppose a woman with a man beside her is perfectly safe? Tell me, Mr. Vale, who decides where the woman goes? Who decides what dangers she can handle? Who decides what truths she can bear to hear? Ashton blinked. I only meant that the territory outside of town is dangerous. There are men who would rob or kill without a second thought. Margaret leaned forward. Men use the word protection the way a locksmith uses a key. It sounds like safety. It looks like safety. But the person holding the key is the one who decides when the door opens and when it stays shut. My father protected our family. He protected us right up until the day we discovered he had gambled away everything we owned and left us with nothing but debts and shame. The words came out hotter and sharper than she intended, and she regretted them immediately. Not because they were untrue, but because they revealed far more than she had meant to share with a man she barely knew. Ashton was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed. The careful formality was gone, replaced by something raw. You are not wrong, he said, about men using protection as control. I have seen it. I have done it, in my own way. I spent the last 5 years protecting the world from myself by disappearing into the mountains. I told myself it was noble. Truth is, it was easier than facing what I had done. They looked at each other across the white tablecloth, and Margaret realized with a start that they had stopped talking about the frontier entirely. They were talking about themselves, about wounds that had nothing to do with cowboys or mountains, and everything to do with the particular kind of damage that comes from people who are supposed to love you. The silence stretched between them, and in it Margaret felt something shift. A wall moved, not down, but sideways, just enough to see the other side. I have things I do not tell anyone, Ashton said quietly. So do I, Margaret answered. It was not a confession. It was not intimacy. It was simply two people acknowledging that they were both carrying heavy loads and recognizing the weight in each other's arms. They finished dinner in a different kind of quiet. Warmer, more careful. When Ashton walked her back toward the boarding house, the evening air was soft and smelled of river water and cut hay. At the corner of Delaware and 3rd, where the boardwalk ended and the dirt street began, Margaret stopped. Something was rising inside her. Not attraction, though that was there too, simmering underneath everything like coals under ash. Something worse. Trust. The first green shoots of it pushing up through the hard, packed ground she had spent 2 years salting and scorching. And it terrified her. So she did what she always did when trust got too close. She set it on fire. Do not think that a few dinners will wash the smell of whatever you are hiding off your hands, Mr. Vale. The words landed like a slap. She watched Ashton's face close like a door slamming shut. The warmth in his blue eyes froze over. His jaw tightened. For a moment, he looked like a man who had just been punched in a wound that had never fully healed. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, tipped his hat, and walked away into the dark. Margaret stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and the silence he left behind was worse than any argument. She had done it again. Pushed someone away with cruelty because it was easier than waiting for them to leave on their own. Burned the bridge before they could be the one to cross it. She told herself it was better this way. She almost believed it. She turned and walked toward the boarding house, not noticing the figure that detached from the shadows behind the feed store, and began following her at a careful distance. But Ashton noticed. He had not gone far. He was standing in the alley between the hardware store and the land office, watching Margaret walk home when he saw the shadow move. Ashton knew that silhouette. He had seen it on wanted posters and in bounty offices, and once, 5 years ago in Abilene, standing beside him at a bar while they discussed the price on a man's head. He followed the shadow into the darkness behind the mercantile. Cleet Harden, Ashton said. The shadow stopped, turned. Ashton could not see the face clearly in the dark, but he did not need to. He knew the voice that came back at him. Flat, even, carrying the mild friendliness of a man who could slit your throat and make small talk at the same time. Ashton Vale. Thought you died up in those mountains. Still playing hero, I see. What are you doing in Leavenworth, Cleet? Business. Cleet leaned against the wall of the Mercantile, casual as a man at a church social. But since you are so curious, I will tell you this much for free. That pretty little seamstress of yours is holding something my employer wants back. Something that was taken from him. Something he needs returned before it causes trouble. And if she does not want to return it? Cleet was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the friendliness in his voice had not changed. But underneath it, Ashton could hear something cold and final as a coffin nail. Then my employer has authorized me to use my discretion. And you know what my discretion looks like, Ashton. You have seen it up close. The silence between the two men was thick enough to cut. Walk away, Ashton. Cleet's voice was almost gentle. This is not your fight. You have no stake in this girl. Go back to your mountains and your traps and your guilt. Unless you want her to find out what you did in Abilene 5 years ago. The words hit Ashton like a rifle butt to the sternum. Cleet knew. Of course Cleet knew. They had been in the same trade, worked the same territory, heard the same stories. Ashton said nothing. He stood in the darkness with his fists clenched at his sides, and the old familiar weight of Abilene pressing down on his chest like a stone. And he watched Cleet Harden melt back into the shadows and disappear. Ashton did not sleep that night, not because of Cleet's threat. He had been threatened before by men far worse and slept like a baby afterward. The sleeplessness came from somewhere else entirely, from a realization that crept through him like cold water through cracked ice. For the first time in 5 years, he had something to lose. It was an absurd thought. He barely knew the woman. He had eaten one meal with her and been insulted for his trouble. She had a tongue like a skinning knife, and the disposition of a cornered wildcat. She had called him essentially a man with blood on his hands, and she had not been wrong. But there, in the dark of his rented room, lying on a mattress that smelled of dust and old straw, Ashton could not stop seeing the way her eyes had softened across the dinner table when she realized they were both carrying the same kind of weight. That flicker of recognition. That split second when the walls came down, and she had looked at him not with suspicion or fear, but with understanding. Then she had burned it, thrown acid on the moment, and walked away. And Ashton knew, with the certainty of a man who recognized self-destruction because he practiced it daily, that she had done it on purpose. She had pushed him away not because she did not care, but because she was beginning to. At first light, Ashton went to find Sheriff Patterson. Patterson was a decent man in his late 40s, lean and weathered, who had kept order in Leavenworth through a combination of fair dealing and a willingness to use force when fair dealing failed. He had won his last election with a comfortable margin and was planning to run again in the fall. He kept his office tidy, his guns clean, and his politics flexible. Ashton found him at his desk, working through a stack of paperwork with a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. "Morning, Vale," Patterson said without looking up. "Need something?" "Information. Man named Victor Holloway. From St. Louis. What do you know about him?" Patterson set down his pen and looked at Ashton with the careful expression of a man choosing his words. "Holloway moved into town about 2 months ago. Bought a stake in the Lucky Dollar Saloon. Made generous donations to several civic organizations. Friendly with Howard Bradley and several members of the town council." Patterson paused. "Why do you ask?" "He has a man working for him. Name of Cleet Harden." Patterson's expression tightened. "I know Harden. He has been asking questions around town, looking for a young woman from St. Louis. I told him to keep his business lawful while he was in my jurisdiction. And has he? So far." Patterson leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Look, Vale, Holloway is a powerful man with powerful friends. He just donated $500 to my re-election campaign. I am not saying that buys my silence, but it buys a certain amount of patience. If you have got something concrete, a specific crime, a specific threat, bring it to me and I will act on it. But I cannot go after a man based on the word of a mountain trapper who does not even live in my town." Ashton left the sheriff's office with his jaw set and his options narrowing. Across town, Margaret was making a discovery of her own. She had arrived at the shop early before Mrs. Henderson and was preparing to open when she noticed that the display of ribbons near the front window had been rearranged. Not obviously, not in a way that a casual observer would detect. But Margaret was not a casual observer. She had spent her life paying attention to details, the way fabric folded, the way light fell across a seam, the way a room changed when someone had moved through it. The ribbons had been shifted. The blue ones were where the green ones should be. Someone had been in the shop overnight. She went immediately to the back room where she kept her personal belongings during work hours. Her basket was undisturbed. Her coat hung where she had left it. But the small pin she always placed at a specific angle on the collar had been moved, just slightly, just enough. Margaret stood very still in the back room of Henderson's dress shop and felt the world tilt under her feet. Someone had searched her belongings, here and at the boarding house. They were looking for something, and they were getting more brazen about it. Her thoughts went to the carpet bag under her bed, to the ledger hidden in its lining. She had carried it for 2 years as a sentimental relic, the last piece of her father, never reading it carefully, never understanding what it truly contained. It was time to understand. The morning passed slowly. Margaret helped customers and discussed patterns with Mrs. Henderson and tried not to think about the carpet bag waiting for her at the boarding house. Just before noon, the shop door opened and Jim Bradley walked in. He looked different again. The flowers and silk handkerchiefs were gone. In their place was a nervous energy that Margaret had not seen from him before. He kept glancing over his shoulder through the shop windows as if expecting someone to be watching. "Miss Vance," he said, and his voice was low and urgent in a way that had nothing to do with courtship. "I need to tell you something, and I do not have much time." Margaret set down the bolt of calico she had been cutting and gave him her full attention. "My father has a guest from St. Louis, a man named Holloway. They have been meeting in my father's study with the doors closed, and last night I heard them mention your name." Jim swallowed. "I do not know what it is about. I do not know what they want. But the way they talked about you like you were a problem that needed solving." He shook his head. "Be careful, Miss Vance. Please." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. The man Holloway has working for him. The one called Hardin. I have seen him watching the shop, more than once." Then Jim was gone out the door and down the street with the quick stride of a man who has just done something that scared him and does not want to linger near the evidence. Margaret stood behind the counter and felt the ground shifting again. Jim Bradley, the cowboy who had stolen a kiss and earned a knife against his ribs, had just warned her about his own father's associates. That took something. Not much, not yet. But it was the first step on a path that Margaret could see stretching out ahead of him toward a destination he could not yet imagine. After Jim left, Mrs. Henderson emerged from the back room. She had been stitching quietly and had heard everything. "He came by yesterday when you were out," Mrs. Henderson said. "Asked me a question I did not expect from a boy like him." "What question?" "He asked if I thought you would ever forgive him." Mrs. Henderson removed her glasses and cleaned them on her apron. "I told him he did not need your forgiveness. I told him he needed to forgive himself for being the kind of man he did not want to be." Margaret felt something unexpected at those words. Not attraction toward Jim. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. She knew what it was like to carry shame that belonged to someone else. She had been carrying her father's shame for 2 years. That afternoon, just before closing time, the shop door opened one more time, and Ashton Vale filled the doorway. He did not look like the man who'd come to buy handkerchiefs. He looked like a man who had been up all night wrestling with something heavy and had finally decided to put it down. "Miss Vance," he said, "I need to talk to you. And it is not about the coat." Margaret considered telling him to leave. The words were right there, sharp and ready, the way they always were when someone got too close. But she remembered the dinner. the silence that had felt like understanding, the way she had set it on fire and watched it burn and had regretted every word since. She did not tell him to leave. She closed the shop door and turned the sign to closed. "Go ahead," she said. "Someone is looking for you. A hired gun named Cleet Harden. He has been in town for about a week, asking questions about a young woman from St. Louis." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know this?" Ashton hesitated. It was a small thing, barely a pause, but Margaret caught it the way she caught a crooked stitch in a seam. "Because I used to do the same work he does." The words landed in the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Margaret felt her walls slam upward, steel and stone, the fortifications she had built from 2 years of betrayal and loss. "You were a bounty hunter," she said. Her voice was flat. "I was. 5 years ago. I quit for reasons I will tell you if you let me, but yes. I hunted men for money. And Cleet Harden is the kind of man who does not stop looking until he finds what he has been sent for." Margaret's hand found the edge of the counter and gripped it. The man she had been beginning to trust, the man whose silence had felt like safety, had spent years hunting people for money. The realization hit her in the exact same place where her father's secret had hit her 2 years ago. That place inside her chest where trust lived, battered and bruised and barely surviving. "Get out of my shop! Miss Vance, if you will just let me explain. I should have known. You have got the same eyes as every man who has ever taken something that was not his. Get out." She knew it was unfair, even as the words left her mouth. She knew she was doing it again, pushing him away with cruelty because the alternative was letting him close enough to hurt her. But the pattern was stronger than the knowledge. The fear was deeper than the fairness. Ashton looked at her for a long moment. His blue eyes held something that might have been pain, or might have been resignation, or might have been both. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out of the shop. Margaret locked the door with hands that shook so badly she could barely turn the key. Then she sat down behind the counter and tried to breathe. She did not go back to the boarding house right away. Instead, she did something she should have done 2 years ago. She reached into her basket, pulled out the carpet bag she had brought with her that morning on instinct, and opened the lining. The ledger was small and leather-bound, the cover stained with what might have been coffee or might have been tears. She opened it to the first page and began to read. Names, dates, dollar amounts, hand after hand of poker and faro recorded in her father's meticulous handwriting. Wins and losses charted over months, and a pattern emerging from the numbers that Margaret, who had inherited her father's head for detail, could see as clearly as a seam in fabric. Her father had been losing. Consistently, impossibly, to the same house, at the same games, on the same nights. The losses were too regular, too precise, too perfectly calibrated to strip away the Vance family's assets piece by piece without triggering suspicion until it was too late. She turned to the final page. The handwriting was different here, shaking, pressed hard into the paper as if the hand that wrote it was trembling with fear or rage or both. Holloway switches the decks. "I have proof. If I die, find Judge Weston in Kansas City." Margaret closed the ledger and sat very still in the darkening shop. Outside, the sounds of Leavenworth at dusk filtered through the windows. Horses, voices, the tinny piano from the saloon down the street. Inside, there was only the sound of her own breathing and the cracking of a story she had built her life around for 2 years. Her father had not been a weak man who gambled away his family's future. Her father had been a man who discovered he was being cheated, who gathered proof, who wrote down names and dates and amounts in a careful ledger, and who died before he could use it. And the death that Margaret had spent 2 years believing was suicide might have been murder. The ledger did not just record debts, it recorded a crime. And on its final page, in her father's trembling hand, it named the criminal and the judge who could bring him to justice. Margaret spent the night reading the ledger 3 times over, memorizing names and figures and dates until they were burned into her mind like brands on cattle hide. By morning, she understood everything. Victor Holloway had run a systematic fraud operation out of his St. Louis gambling house, using marked decks and rigged games to strip wealthy families of their assets. Her father, Edward Vance, had been one of his targets. But Edward had been smarter than Holloway expected. He had noticed the pattern. He had kept records. He had written everything down. And then he had died. Margaret had been told it was suicide. A gunshot in the study. A note that said only "I am sorry." She had believed it because the shame of gambling debts made the story plausible, and because she was 21 years old and alone and did not have the resources or the will to question it. Now she questioned everything. The first thing she did was take the ledger to Sheriff Patterson. Patterson read through it carefully, his brow furrowed, his coffee growing cold. When he finished, he looked up at Margaret with the expression of a man caught between his conscience and his circumstances. "I believe you, Miss Vance. This is detailed and damning, but it is one man's handwriting in a private journal, a dead man's handwriting. To go after someone like Holloway, I need more. I need a witness. I need corroboration. I need someone alive who can testify to what is in this book. And until then, I cannot move against a man who just donated $500 to my re-election fund and is partners with the biggest rancher in the county." Patterson had the decency to look ashamed. "I am sorry, I truly am, but that is the reality." Margaret took the ledger back and left the sheriff's office with a bitter taste in her mouth and a new understanding of how power worked on the frontier. It was not so different from how it worked in St. Louis. Money talked. Justice listened. That night, Margaret was shaken awake by screaming. Not the kind of screaming that comes from nightmares, the kind that comes from people running in the street and shouting the word that every frontier town dreaded above all others: fire. She threw on a dress and ran to Delaware Street. A crowd had gathered in front of Henderson's dress shop. Flames were licking up the back wall where someone had piled fabric scraps against the clapboard siding and set them alight. The fire was not large, not yet. It had not reached the main building, but it was consuming the imported silk that Mrs. Henderson stored in the back lean-to, and the heat was intense enough that the shop windows were beginning to crack. Margaret grabbed a bucket from the horse trough and joined the bucket brigade that was forming. She passed water, sloshed more on herself than on the fire, and worked until her arms ached and her lungs burned from the smoke. She was reaching for another bucket when a pair of larger hands took it from her. She looked up and saw Ashton Vale, his face smeared with soot, his sleeves rolled up past those scarred wrists, already throwing water on the flames with the efficiency of a man who had fought forest fires in the high country. They worked side by side without speaking, passed buckets, stomped embers, soaked the walls of the shop with water to keep the fire from spreading. When it was finally out, they stood in the street amid the steam and smoke and surveyed the damage. The lean-to was gone. 3 bolts of imported silk worth months of Mrs. Henderson's income were reduced to ash. The back wall of the shop was scorched, but intact. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of her ruined lean-to with her arms crossed and her jaw set. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried when things burned. She was the kind who rebuilt. "This was not an accident," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice flat with certainty. "Someone set this fire on purpose." Margaret knew she was right, and she knew, with the guilt that sat in her stomach like a stone, that the fire was a message meant for her. Her presence in this town was endangering the people she cared about. She felt Ashton's hand on her shoulder, turned to face him. He held out his canteen and she took it, and when their fingers touched, neither one of them pulled away. "I said terrible things to you," Margaret said. Her voice was hoarse from smoke. "You said what you felt." "No. I said what I thought would make you leave. There is a difference." Ashton looked at her for a long time in the firelight. Soot was streaked across his forehead, and his eyes were the color of the sky right before dawn, clear and deep and full of something that looked like hope, trying very hard not to show itself. "There is a difference," he agreed quietly. Margaret took a breath. It tasted like smoke and courage. "I need your help," she said, "not because I cannot handle this alone. I probably can, but because I am tired of handling everything alone." And then, because she had made a promise to herself that morning in the sheriff's office that she would never again let fear make her stupid, she made Ashton Vale a promise of her own. "You tell me everything, the whole truth. Nothing hidden. If I catch you in a single lie, we are done. Not angry done, just done. Do you understand?" "I understand," Ashton said. They sat on the front porch of the boarding house while the town settled back into sleep around them. The fire was out. The excitement was over. Leavenworth returned to the particular quiet of a frontier town after midnight. All creaking wood and distant coyotes and the occasional bark of a dog, dreaming of rabbits. Ashton told her everything about Abilene. "5 years ago," he said, speaking to the darkness rather than to her face, "I was working as a bounty hunter. Good money. Dangerous work. I tracked a man named Thomas Garrett across 2 territories. He had a warrant for bank robbery out of Wichita. I found him in Abilene hiding in a boarding house not much different from this one." Ashton paused. His hands were clasped between his knees and his eyes were fixed on the street. "I shot him. He drew on me, and I shot him. Clean. Fast. He was dead before he hit the floor. And then the sheriff in Abilene told me the warrant was wrong. Garrett had been cleared of the charges a week before I found him. The paperwork had not caught up. I killed an innocent man." Margaret said nothing. She sat beside him in the dark and listened. "He had a daughter, 8 years old, name of Lily. She was staying with neighbors while her father traveled. When I found out what I had done, I tried to make it right. I send money every year, anonymous, enough to pay for her schooling and her keep, but money does not bring back a father." Ashton's voice cracked on the last word, and Margaret understood that this was a wound that had never closed, that he had been bleeding from it for 5 years, slowly, invisibly, the way a man bleeds from a gut wound that does not kill him fast enough. "That is why I went to the mountains," he said. "Not because I love the solitude, because I do not trust myself around people, because the last time I acted on what I believed was right, an innocent man died and a little girl lost her father. I decided I was too dangerous to walk among decent folk, so I disappeared." Margaret reached out and touched his hand. His skin was rough and warm, and his fingers tightened around hers with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "You have been punishing yourself with loneliness," she said. "So have I. We are more alike than I want to admit." In return, she told him about the ledger, about her father's gambling debts that might not have been his fault, about the death that might not have been suicide, about running from St. Louis with nothing but a carpetbag and a burden of shame that she was only now beginning to understand she might have been carrying for the wrong reasons. She told him about the stolen kiss, and how it had felt like one more man deciding what she was worth without asking. She told him about the knife in her pocket and how some days it was the only thing that made her feel safe. When she finished, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, and the first birds were testing their voices in the cottonwood trees along the river. "We make a fine pair," Ashton said. "A woman who pushes everyone away and a man who hides from the world." Margaret almost smiled. "At least we are consistent." And somewhere in the saloon district, in a room above the Lucky Dollar that smelled of cigar smoke and cheap whiskey, Cleet Harden sat at a desk and wrote a letter to Victor Holloway in St. Louis. "Found the Vance girl. She has the ledger. But there is a problem. Ashton Vale is protecting her. The dress shop fire did not scare her off. She is stubborn. Send more men. Or let me use the Bradley boy." He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and handed it to a rider who would carry it east by morning. Margaret never imagined she would willingly walk into the home of her enemy wearing the finest dress she had ever sewn, but that was exactly what she was about to do. The ball at Bradley Ranch was the social event of the Leavenworth season. Howard Bradley threw it every June, ostensibly to celebrate the end of spring roundup, but really to display his wealth and consolidate his influence over the town's business and political leaders. Everyone who mattered in Leavenworth would be there, including, Margaret was certain, Victor Holloway. The plan was hers. She had conceived it the morning after the fire, sitting in the scorched remains of Mrs. Henderson's lean-to with the ledger in her lap, and a fury in her chest that had burned away the last of her fear. Sheriff Patterson needed corroboration, a witness, something more than a dead man's handwriting. If Holloway was at the ball talking to Howard Bradley about his business dealings, there might be conversations worth overhearing. Letters left in a study, documents that could tie the gambling house operation to specific crimes. Margaret told Ashton her plan over breakfast at a small cafe near the river. He listened with the careful attention of a man evaluating a trap line, testing each point for weakness. Then he exploded. "You are walking straight into the wolf's mouth," he said, keeping his voice low enough that the other diners could not hear, but firm enough that Margaret could feel the force of it. "Holloway threatened to kill you. You heard him say it. And you want to walk into his partner's house and start snooping through his papers?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with precise control. "And you are treating me like a child who needs protecting. That is exactly the kind of man I left St. Louis to get away from." The words hit their mark. She could see it in the way Ashton's shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched. For a long moment he was silent, and Margaret could see the battle playing out behind his blue eyes. The protector in him wanting to lock her in a room until the danger passed. The part that respected her, wanting to let her make her own choices. The second part won. "You are right," he said, and the admission cost him something. She could hear it in his voice. "So, we go together." They went together. Margaret spent 3 days making her dress for the ball. Green silk with hand-stitched lace at the cuffs, a fitted bodice that showed her figure to advantage, and a full skirt that moved like water when she walked. She sewed a hidden pocket into the lining of the bodice just large enough for the ledger. She was not letting it out of her possession. Ashton cleaned up as best a mountain man could. He trimmed his beard, tied his hair back, and wore a new shirt that Mrs. Henderson had produced from her stock, with the observation that even grizzly bears ought to look presentable at a dance. Bradley Ranch sprawled across 300 acres of prime Kansas grassland south of town. The main house was a 2-story limestone affair, with a columned porch and real glass windows that glowed warm and golden, as Margaret and Ashton rode up the long approach road on a rented buggy. The ballroom occupied the entire ground floor of the east wing. Fiddles and a piano played something lively. Couples danced. Laughter mixed with the clink of crystal and the low buzz of political conversation. The room was bright with candles and oil lamps, and the air smelled of roast beef and perfume, and the particular musk of 100 bodies packed into a space designed for 50. Margaret scanned the room through her professional eye before she scanned it through any other. Clothing told her everything. The mayor's wife wore an imported French silk that Mrs. Henderson had ordered months ago. Sheriff Patterson's coat was new but poorly fitted, bought off the rack from the mercantile. Howard Bradley himself wore a suit of English wool that would have cost 6 months of a working man's wages. And there, standing beside Howard near the fireplace, was Victor Holloway. Margaret recognized his vest before she recognized his face. It was made by Fournier's of St. Louis, the most expensive tailor in the city. Her mother had sewed piecework for Fournier's before her marriage, and Margaret had grown up studying the shop's signature techniques. She could see the distinctive chain stitch along the pocket seam from 20 feet away. This was the man who had destroyed her family. He stood in Howard Bradley's ballroom drinking Howard Bradley's champagne, and he looked exactly like what he was, a predator in expensive clothing. Jim Bradley found her within minutes of her arrival. He was wearing his best suit and his most earnest expression, and when he asked Margaret to dance, she accepted. This surprised Ashton, who was standing near the refreshment table, trying to look inconspicuous and failing comprehensively. A man his size did not blend into ballroom crowds. He watched Margaret take Jim Bradley's hand and step onto the dance floor, and he felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Jealousy. He hated it. Jealousy was a loss of control. And control was the only thing standing between Ashton Vale and the man he used to be. He gripped his glass of punch and watched and tried to remember that Margaret was executing a plan, not choosing a partner. On the dance floor, Jim Bradley held Margaret at a proper distance and led her through a waltz with more skill than she expected from a cattleman's son. "Holloway is in my father's study," Jim whispered as they turned past the orchestra. "They have been meeting all evening, talking about you." Margaret's heart hammered. "Do you know what they are saying?" "I know enough. He wants something you have, a book or a ledger of some kind, and he does not care what happens to you in the getting of it." Jim's face was tight with something that looked like shame. "I can get you to the back hallway. There is a door to the study that my father leaves unlocked during parties so he can slip away for cigars. But if you are caught, I cannot help you. I will deny everything." Margaret studied his face as they danced. He was scared. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes and the sweat beading at his hairline. But he was doing it anyway, choosing a side. One foot still planted in his father's world, but the other stepping toward something else. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because Mrs. Henderson was right. I need to stop being the kind of man I do not want to be." Jim looked away. "And because what they are planning to do to you is wrong. Even I can see that." The dance ended. Jim guided Margaret toward the back of the ballroom with a smooth turn, and then she was in the hallway, moving fast and quiet toward the study door. The study was dark. Margaret pressed her ear against the heavy oak door and listened. Two voices, Holloway's, smooth and cultured and cold, and Howard Bradley's, deeper and rougher, the voice of a man who had built his fortune with his hands before he started building it with his connections. "That ledger can destroy everything I have built," Holloway was saying. "Every arrangement, every investment, every partnership. If it reaches the wrong hands, I'm looking at years in the state penitentiary." "What do you want me to do about it?" Howard asked. "Find it. Use your son if you have to. He's been sniffing around the girl for weeks. Get him close to her. And if the ledger cannot be recovered quietly, then it needs to be recovered any other way. And the girl? I do not care whether she lives or not." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She had suspected it. Reading the ledger, hearing Jim's warning, seeing the fire at the dress shop, but hearing it spoken aloud in the flat, business-like tone of a man discussing a property transaction made it real in a way that nothing else had. She turned to leave and stopped. At the far end of the hallway, in the warm light spilling from the ballroom doorway, she saw Ashton Vale. He was standing with Howard Bradley, who had apparently emerged from another entrance to the study. And as Margaret watched, hidden in the shadows, Ashton reached out and shook Howard Bradley's hand. The sight hit her like a fist to the stomach. She had just heard Holloway threaten her life inside that study, and Ashton was shaking hands with Holloway's partner, smiling, making some kind of deal. Every fear she carried about trusting men crystallized in that handshake. Her father hiding the truth, Jim taking what he wanted, and now Ashton, who had promised everything, standing in the hallway making agreements with the enemy. She did not know what the handshake meant. She did not wait to find out. She turned and walked fast toward the back entrance of the ranch house, her eyes burning and her jaw set against the scream building in her throat. Ashton found her outside, leaning against the buggy with her arms wrapped around herself as if she were cold despite the warm June night. "Margaret, what happened? Did you find something?" She looked at him, wanted to say something cruel, wanted to push him away with the same acid tongue she always used when trust got too close. But the words would not come this time. Not because she did not have them, but because she was tired. Tired of burning bridges. Tired of salting the ground where good things tried to grow. Instead, she grabbed the front of his shirt and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss, not a tentative first exploration. It was a desperate, contradictory thing. She wanted him and she was terrified of him, and both of those feelings were true at the same time, and the kiss held all of it. His mouth against hers, his hands coming up to cradle her face, as if she were something precious and dangerous in equal measure. The smell of him, wood smoke and cedar, and the taste of punch and the night air, and something underneath it all that was just Ashton, just the man underneath the mountain, and the guilt and the scars. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and the night was very quiet around them. "We need to leave Leavenworth," Margaret said. "I know a place, but you will have to trust me completely." Margaret thought about her father, about every man who had ever broken her trust. She thought about the handshake she had seen in the hallway and the kiss she had just given despite it. "Lead the way," she said, and hated herself a little for meaning it. They left Leavenworth at 4 in the morning, before the sun could betray which direction they had gone. Margaret carried two things: her father's ledger, tucked against her chest inside her dress, and the pistol Ashton had spent 3 days teaching her to fire without her hitting a single target yet. The morning was cool and damp, with mist rising off the river like smoke from a fire that had burned down to embers. They rode west, away from the town and the river and the neat rectangles of civilization, into rolling prairie that stretched out in every direction, like a green ocean, under a sky so wide it made Margaret feel like a speck of dust on a ballroom floor. Ashton rode ahead on a dun-colored gelding that moved beneath him like an extension of his own body. Margaret followed on a bay mare that Mrs. Henderson had lent her with the stern instruction to bring her back alive and well-fed. A pack mule trailed behind, loaded with enough supplies for 2 weeks in the high country. Margaret had never ridden more than a few miles at a stretch. By noon, every muscle from her waist to her ankles was screaming. By evening, she was fairly certain she had been born without hip joints, and someone had installed wooden pegs in their place while she was not paying attention. Ashton made camp beside a creek that ran clear and cold over smooth stones. He built a fire with the casual efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and cooked dinner over the flames: dried venison, hard biscuits, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in a boot. Margaret looked at the plate he handed her, and then looked at him. "What is this?" she asked. "Supper. This is boot leather with seasoning." Ashton almost smiled. That look came over his face again, the ghost of a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth like a shy animal peering out from behind a rock. "It is trail food. It keeps well and fills the belly. So does sawdust. Doesn't mean I would eat it willingly." The second day, Ashton made a mistake. He was so focused on watching the trail behind them, scanning for Cleet Harden or anyone else who might be following, that he missed a trail marker and led them down a wrong fork that wound deeper into a canyon with no outlet. They lost half a day backtracking and ran low on water before finding the creek again. Margaret was furious. Ashton was worse than furious. He was humiliated. This was his territory, his mountains. He knew every trail and game path and water source within 50 miles of his cabin, and he had led them astray because his mind was not on the mountain in front of him, but on the woman riding behind him and the danger she was in. That was the part that scared him most. Not the mistake itself, but the reason for it. Caring about someone was making him sloppy, slow, inattentive, and in the high country, inattention killed. On the third night, a thunderstorm rolled in from the west like a wall of black water. Lightning split the sky into jagged, bright pieces, and the rain fell so hard it sounded like gravel being poured on a tin roof. They found shelter in a shallow cave above the tree line, barely deep enough for 2 people in their gear. The horses were hobbled under a rock overhang below. The fire would not catch in the wind-driven rain, so they sat in the darkness and listened to the storm throw itself against the mountains. It was in this cave, wrapped in a shared blanket because the temperature had dropped and there was no fire to warm them, that Margaret told Ashton about the night her father died. "I found him in his study," she said. Her voice was very quiet, almost lost under the rain. He was in his chair. The gun was on the floor beside him. There was a note. It said, "I am sorry." That was all. "I am sorry." Margaret had not cried about her father in 2 years. She had been too angry, too ashamed, too busy surviving. But here in a cave on a mountain with a storm raging outside and a man's arm around her shoulders, the tears came, not gentle tears. the kind that come from a place so deep they feel more like bleeding than crying. Ashton said nothing. He just held her. And that silence, that patient, steady presence in the dark, was the most trustworthy thing Margaret had ever experienced. He did not try to fix it. He did not offer empty words, he simply stayed. And staying, she was learning, was the hardest and most valuable thing a person could do. When the tears stopped, Margaret wiped her face with the back of her hand and said something she had been thinking about since the ball. "Why were you shaking Howard Bradley's hand?" Ashton stiffened beside her. Then, slowly, he answered, "I was trying to buy information. Howard is a businessman before he is anything else. I offered him prime trapping territory in exchange for details about Holloway's operation. Names, dates, anything that might give us leverage. And did he give you anything? He told me Holloway is desperate. The ledger is the only thing that can connect him to the fraud ring. Without it, he is untouchable. With it, he goes to the state penitentiary at Lansing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me." "I know. I should have told you. I was trying to protect you." There is that word again. Protect. She did not say it angrily this time. She said it sadly. And Ashton heard the difference. "You are right," he said. "No more protecting without permission. No more deciding for you." Outside, the storm was moving east, the thunder growing distant and the rain softening. Inside the cave, in the darkness, Margaret turned toward Ashton and put her hand on his chest. She could feel his heart beating under her palm. Steady, strong, scared. "If we do this," Ashton said, and his voice was rough, "I need you to know something. I am not good at the after. I do not know how to stay." "Then let me teach you," Margaret said. She kissed him. Not like the kiss at the ranch, desperate and contradictory. This one was slower, deliberate, a choice made with eyes open and walls down. And when he kissed her back, she felt something inside her shift and settle, like a bone that had been out of joint for years, finally sliding back into place. The rest of the night belonged to them. Steamy and tender, and full of the particular vulnerability that comes when two people who have spent their lives building fortresses finally open the gates. The next morning, while Ashton scouted the trail ahead, Margaret did something she would come to regret. She wrote a letter to Judge Weston in Kansas City, described the ledger's contents, named Holloway, detailed the threats. She wrote quickly on a scrap of paper from her basket, folded it, and sealed it with a drop of candle wax. She did not tell Ashton. She told herself it was because the letter needed to go out before they disappeared into the mountains. She told herself it was insurance, a backup plan in case something happened to her and the ledger. But the truth was simpler and uglier than that. She still did not fully trust him. The handshake at the ball was still lodged in her mind like a splinter. Her father had hidden the truth. Ashton had hidden the handshake. And Margaret's core, the part of her that would rather control everything alone than depend on anyone else, would not let her rest. Around midday, they passed a trader heading east with a pack mule and a friendly wave. Margaret paid him $1 to carry her letter to the nearest post office. She did not know the trader was one of Cleet Hardin's scouts. She did not know her letter would never reach Kansas City. She did not know she had just drawn a map to their destination and handed it to the enemy. She knew only that the letter was gone and the responsibility was hers. And that small illusion of control calmed the frightened thing inside her just enough to let her keep riding west. That night, Margaret woke to find Ashton sitting upright with his rifle across his knees, his eyes fixed on the dark tree line. "Someone is following us," he said without turning around. "Has been for 2 days." Margaret's hand moved to the pistol at her side. She thought about the letter she had given the trader that morning, and a cold certainty settled in her stomach that she could not yet name. Ashton's cabin was more beautiful than Margaret had imagined, and lonelier than any place she had ever seen. The two things did not contradict each other. They explained each other. It sat in a high valley surrounded by peaks so tall their tops were lost in clouds. The only way in was a narrow trail that wound through dense forest and crossed a creek of water so clear Margaret could count the stones on the bottom from horseback. The valley itself was a bowl of green meadow ringed by pine and aspen, and when they rode out of the tree line and Margaret saw it for the first time, she understood why a man who wanted to disappear from the world would choose this place. The cabin was built of thick logs, chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that caught the light like eyes watching the approach trail. A small, covered porch fronted the main door, and there were outbuildings for storing pelts and equipment and keeping horses out of the weather. "Welcome home," Ashton said. Then he caught himself. "Welcome to the cabin, I mean." Margaret did not correct him, but she noticed the slip, and something warm moved through her chest. Inside the cabin was a single large room with a sleeping loft above. Margaret saw immediately what the space told her about its occupant. One chair at the table, a bed built for one person. No mirror anywhere. Not on the wall, not by the washstand, not propped on a shelf. Ashton Vale did not look at himself, but the space was not neglected. There was a small bookshelf with a dozen volumes, their spines worn from rereading. Hand-drawn maps covered one wall, detailed and beautiful, showing terrain that Ashton must have spent years exploring. And near the bed, on a shelf by itself, sat a wooden box. Margaret opened it later, looking for a clean cloth to strain the coffee Ashton was making badly on the iron stove. Inside the box, neatly bundled and tied with twine, were small packets of money. Each one was labeled with a date and a name. Lily Garrett, the orphaned girl in Abilene. Margaret closed the box carefully and looked across the cabin at Ashton, who was cursing quietly at the stove because the coffee had boiled over again. She understood something about him in that moment that went deeper than anything he had told her with words. This was a man who sent money to a dead man's daughter every year and kept a meticulous record of every payment. A man who had no mirror because he could not bear to look at himself. A man who had built a beautiful home in the most isolated place he could find because he believed he did not deserve to live anywhere else. Margaret made biscuits while Ashton cleaned up the coffee disaster. They moved around each other in the small space with the awkward tenderness of two people who had spent their lives alone and were trying to learn the choreography of sharing. She reached for the same cup he was reaching for, and their hands collided. He turned from the stove and bumped her hip as she passed behind him. Small collisions, small apologies, small smiles that neither of them quite knew what to do with. Outside, Ashton rigged a clothesline using a length of rope from his gear. Margaret noticed the rope. She had noticed it before, coiled neatly in his saddlebag. There were coils of rope throughout the cabin, too. On hooks, by the door, near the traps. Rope was Ashton's constant companion, the tool of his trade, the thing he could always count on to hold. She picked up a piece from the hook near the door and ran it through her fingers. It was worn soft from use and warm from the cabin's heat. Ashton watched her do it, and something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, memory. He did not explain the rope, not yet. But he took another length of it and strung the clothesline without being asked, and when Margaret hung her spare dress on it to air out, the rope held. That was the first transformation. From binding to building. From holding things down to holding things up. The morning was quiet and slow, and full of the kind of domestic intimacy that Margaret had not experienced since childhood. Ashton made more coffee, successfully this time. Margaret mended a tear in his spare shirt, using her good thread and her steady hands and her eye for the kind of stitching that would hold through hard use. They did not talk much. They did not need to. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers or the silence of people hiding from each other. It was the silence of two people who had decided to be in the same room and found that the room was better for it. Then Margaret opened the wrong box. She was looking for a cloth to filter the coffee grounds. The wooden box was on the shelf near the stove, and she opened it without thinking, assuming it contained kitchen supplies. The money bundles were on top. Lily Garrett's payments. Beneath them, folded and yellowed with age, was a piece of paper that Margaret pulled out and unfolded before she realized what it was. A wanted poster. Old, brittle at the edges, and the face drawn on it in rough ink was unmistakably Ashton Vale, younger, thinner, but him. Younger, thinner. The charges listed were not for the Abilene killing. They were for stagecoach robbery. The date on the poster placed the crime 11 years ago when Ashton would have been 13 years old. Margaret stood in the middle of the cabin with the wanted poster in her hands and felt the ground fall away beneath her. He had told her about Abilene. He had sat on the boarding house porch in Leavenworth and told her the worst thing he had ever done. And she had listened, and she had understood, and she had chosen to trust him anyway. But he had not told her this. He had promised. Everything. Nothing hidden. She had made him swear it, and he had looked her in the eye and said, "I understand." And he had lied. When Ashton came in from checking the horses, Margaret was standing by the table with the poster laid flat in front of her. She did not need to say anything. He saw the paper, and his face went white. "Margaret," he began, "you promised." She was not shouting. Ashton watched her pack, and did not try to stop her. Not because he did not want to, but because his own core flaw was whispering in his ear the way it always did when things fell apart. "See? You were never worthy of her. You were never worthy of anyone. Let her go. Go back to the silence where you belong." As she packed, Margaret's mind turned to the letter. The letter she had given the traitor. If Cleet's people intercepted it, they would know she was heading into the mountains. They would know she was with Ashton. They would follow the trail and find the cabin. Her need for control. Her refusal to trust Ashton enough to coordinate with him. Her secret letter, sent without his knowledge because she could not let go of the wheel even for a moment. She had led the enemy to their door, and the realization hit her like a bucket of ice water in the face. Margaret was reaching for the cabin door when the gunshot cracked through the valley like a whip. Then another. Then the sound of horses, many horses, coming fast through the trees. Cleet Harden had found the cabin, and Margaret knew, with a sickness that went all the way to her bones, that it was her letter that had shown him the way. Cleet did not come alone. He brought 3 hired guns and Victor Holloway himself, who sat on a black horse at the edge of the tree line like a banker surveying a foreclosure. Inside the cabin, Margaret and Ashton faced each other across the space that was still thick with their unfinished argument. The wanted poster lay on the table between them. The carpet bag sat by the door, half packed. Outside, the sound of horses and men's voices grew louder. Margaret spoke first. "I led them here. The letter I sent from the trail. I gave it to one of Cleet's men. This is my fault." She expected anger. She expected "I told you so." She expected the kind of righteous fury that would have been entirely justified. Ashton picked up his rifle. "Then we fix it together," he said quietly. And there was no anger in his voice, no blame, just the steady calm of a man who had decided what mattered and what did not. They moved fast. Ashton knew the cabin the way Margaret knew a dress pattern, every angle and every blind spot. He positioned himself at the front windows with his rifle. Margaret took the back wall, where the chinking between logs had cracked enough to create a narrow gap she could fire through. Holloway's voice carried from the tree line. "Miss Vance, hand over the ledger, and I will let you walk away. It is that simple." Margaret checked the load in her pistol and said nothing. The first shot came from one of the hired guns, punching through the front window and burying itself in the far wall. Ashton returned fire immediately, a single precise shot that sent the gunman diving behind a fallen log. Margaret watched the back of the cabin through her firing gap. One of the hired guns was trying to circle around, moving through the trees with the low crouch of a man who had done this before. Margaret sighted along the pistol barrel, squeezed the trigger, and missed. The shot kicked up dirt 3 feet to the left of her target. She fired again, missed again, though closer. The man kept coming. Margaret took a breath, steadied her hands the way Ashton had taught her, and fired a 3rd time. The shot hit the man in the thigh. He went down screaming, clutching his leg. It was ugly and imperfect, and Margaret's hands would not stop shaking. But the man was down, and the back approach was clear. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with gun smoke and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Ashton worked the front windows with methodical precision, keeping the remaining gunmen pinned behind cover and preventing them from advancing. Then a new voice cut through the chaos, a voice that Margaret recognized. "Margaret, give him the ledger. This is the only way nobody dies." Jim Bradley rode out of the trees on a lathered horse, his hands raised. He dismounted and walked toward Holloway's line with his arms spread wide. Ashton cursed under his breath. "I knew it. Rich man's son. They never stand on the right side." But Margaret was watching Jim's face. She was watching the way he positioned himself. Not behind Holloway. Not safely to the side. He was walking directly toward Cleet Harden, who stood at the far left of the line with his rifle aimed at the cabin. Jim stopped barely 3 feet from Cleet, close enough to touch. Nobody else seemed to notice where Jim was standing. Nobody except Margaret, who had spent her whole life reading the small details that other people missed. The stitch that did not match, the clasp that faced the wrong way, the man who walked toward the most dangerous gunman on the field instead of away from him. Jim was not surrendering. He was positioning himself. Cleet turned his rifle toward the cabin, toward the gap in the back wall where Margaret was crouched. For one terrible second, Margaret saw the rifle barrel swing toward her like a black eye opening. Jim drew and fired. The shot hit Cleet in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. Cleet fired back on reflex, the bullet catching Jim in the stomach. Jim went down. Everything exploded into motion. The remaining hired gun broke and ran. Holloway wheeled his horse toward the trees. Ashton burst from the cabin door and went after Cleet, who was wounded but still armed and staggering toward the forest. Margaret ran to Jim. He was lying on his back with his hand pressed against his stomach and blood spreading between his fingers in a dark stain. "You idiot," Margaret whispered, pressing her own hands over his. "You absolute idiot." Jim looked up at her with glassy eyes and the ghost of that cocky grin. Had to get close to him, only way to stop him. He coughed. "Tell Mrs. Henderson. I finally did something she would be proud of." Margaret tore strips from her petticoat with the speed and precision of a woman whose hands had been trained to cut fabric since childhood. She packed the wound and pressed hard and prayed to a God she had not spoken to in 2 years. In the forest, Ashton found Cleet leaning against a pine tree, his shoulder bleeding freely, his rifle on the ground beside him. Even wounded, Cleet managed that flat professional calm. "You think that girl will love you when she knows you're the same as me?" Cleet said. "We are the same breed, Vale. We hunt, we kill, we get paid. The only difference between us is you feel bad about it." The words hit Ashton in the place where Abilene lived. That dark room in his chest where a man named Thomas Garrett died every night, and an 8-year-old girl lost her father every morning. Then Margaret's voice cut through the trees like light through a crack in a wall. "You are not like him. End this, Ashton. End this." Her voice. The voice of a woman who knew his worst secrets, all of them, and chose him anyway. Who had been angry enough to leave and scared enough to stay, and brave enough to shout across a battlefield that he was worth believing in. Ashton raised his rifle and fired. Cleet went down. Margaret found Holloway inside the cabin. He had slipped around back while the fighting was at the front, and he was going through the shelves and boxes, searching for the ledger with the desperate hands of a man watching his empire crumble. He turned and found Margaret in the doorway with Ashton's pistol leveled at his chest. "You will not shoot," Holloway said. He smiled the way a snake smiles, if snakes could smile. "You are your father's daughter. Weak." "My father was not weak," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. "You killed him because he was brave enough to write down the truth." For a moment, the cabin was perfectly still. Holloway's smile faltered. He looked at the pistol in Margaret's hands, and the look in Margaret's eyes, and for the first time since he had arrived in Kansas, Victor Holloway was not sure what was going to happen next. Margaret did not shoot. She kicked his weapon away. She shoved him against the wall. She pulled the ledger from the hidden pocket in her dress and held it up where he could see it. Then she turned and walked outside where Jim Bradley lay bleeding in the dirt, and she placed the ledger in his hands. "Get this to Judge Weston in Kansas City," she said. "Make it right for both our families." Jim's bloody fingers closed around the ledger. He nodded once. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. In the silence that followed the last gunshot, birds began to sing again. Smoke drifted through the cabin. Sunlight poured through bullet holes in the log walls, casting small, bright circles on the floor and on the faces of the people who stood among the wreckage. Margaret and Ashton faced each other across the bullet-scarred cabin. Blood and soot and gun smoke and the wreckage of their fight with the world and with each other lay scattered between them, like the remains of a storm. "I'm still angry at you," Margaret said. "I know," Ashton answered. "But you just called me by my first name, for the first time, so I still have a chance." It took 3 weeks to patch the bullet holes in the cabin walls, 2 weeks for Judge Weston to issue an arrest warrant for Victor Holloway, and 1 night, only 1 night, for Margaret to forgive Ashton Vale. Jim Bradley survived. Barely. Ashton loaded him onto a travois and dragged him down the mountain to Leavenworth, where Dr. Morrison spent 4 hours removing the bullet and stitching the wound with hands that shook from exhaustion and too much coffee. Jim lost a great deal of blood and spent 2 weeks in bed at the boarding house, where Mrs. Callahan fussed over him and Mrs. Henderson brought soup, and Margaret visited once to tell him that the ledger had reached Judge Weston safely by military courier. Victor Holloway was arrested by a United States Marshal on a Tuesday morning in August. He was transported under armed guard to the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing, where he would await trial for fraud, conspiracy, and suspicion of murder in the death of Edward Vance. Cleet Harden survived his wounds. He was tried in the Leavenworth County Courthouse and sentenced to 12 years at the state penitentiary for assault, attempted murder, and arson. He said nothing during his trial and showed no emotion when the sentence was read. Jim Bradley testified against both Holloway and his own father. Howard Bradley was investigated, but the evidence against him was circumstantial, and he avoided prison. His reputation, however, did not survive. Within 6 months, half his ranch hands had quit, and 3 of his business partners had severed ties. Howard Bradley would die 4 years later, alone in his limestone house, having outlived his fortune and his good name. Jim lost his inheritance, his family name, and his place in Leavenworth society. He wrote Margaret 1 letter. "You were right. Some things are worth more than money. It cost me a fortune to learn that. Thank you." When he was strong enough to ride, Jim Bradley left Leavenworth heading south. He took nothing from his father. The last anyone heard, he had found work as a ranch foreman in Texas, earning his way on his own terms for the first time in his life. The night of the forgiveness happened on the cabin porch, under more stars than Margaret had ever imagined the sky could hold. The peaks were black silhouettes against the Milky Way, and the only sounds were wind in the pines and the creek running over stones in the darkness below. Margaret spoke first. "I am not angry because you have a past. Everyone has a past. I am angry because you did not trust me enough to tell me. You decided for me that I could not handle the truth about a 13-year-old boy who robbed a stagecoach and got his life turned around by a good uncle. You decided for me. That is what my father did to my mother. That is what Jim Bradley did when he kissed me without asking. Everyone decides for Margaret. And you promised you would be different." Ashton sat beside her in the dark. When he spoke, his voice was raw and stripped of everything except honesty. "You are right. I was afraid of losing you, so I hid. But hiding is just another way of losing." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said what she had been carrying since the battle. "I need to tell you something, too. I sent that letter without telling you. I gave it to that traitor on the trail because I did not trust you after I saw you shake Howard Bradley's hand. I needed to control everything myself because I was terrified of depending on anyone. And my fear is what led Cleet to us. I almost got us both killed. I almost got Jim killed." Ashton turned to look at her. "So we both kept secrets. We both thought we knew better than the other person." Margaret nodded. "Never again." Never again, Ashton said. They sat together in the silence and let the words settle. This was not a dramatic reconciliation. There was no sweeping music, no grand gesture, no falling into each other's arms. It was simpler and harder than that. Two flawed people looking at each other clearly, seeing every scar and every mistake, and choosing to stay. That was what love looked like when you stripped away the fairy tales. Not perfection, not rescue, just two people who kept choosing each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. A long time passed. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. Somewhere in the forest, an owl called and another answered. "Ashton Vale," Margaret said. "Yes. I do not need you to rescue me. I do not need you to protect me. I want you beside me, building, healing, living. Do you want that?" Ashton, the most laconic man in the territory, the man who had spent 5 years rationing words like winter supplies, said one word. Yes, and one word was enough. 6 months later, on a spring morning with snow still clinging to the highest peaks and wildflowers pushing up through the meadow grass in the valley, Margaret sat on the cabin porch sewing. She was not making a dress for a customer. She was stitching a cushion for the second chair at the kitchen table. Ashton had built the chair last week from pine boards he had milled himself. It was not a fancy chair. The legs were slightly uneven, and the back was a little crooked. But it was solid, and it was real, and it meant that a cabin built for one was now a home for two. Ashton emerged from the tree line carrying an armload of firewood. He stopped when he saw her on the porch, did not speak, just stood there in the morning light with wood in his arms and sawdust in his beard, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he was sure he would never have. Margaret looked up from her sewing and caught his gaze. She smiled. Not the careful, controlled smile she had worn like armor for 2 years. A real smile. The kind that happens when a person is no longer afraid of what it reveals. On the porch railing, a coil of rope held a clay pot with a wildflower growing in it. The same kind of wildflower that had appeared on the dress shop doorstep in Leavenworth all those months ago. Margaret had never asked who left it. She suspected. She had never needed to confirm. Ashton set down the firewood, walked to the porch, stood in front of her. "This time, I am asking permission," he said. Margaret set down her sewing and stood. She looked up into those blue eyes, the color of the sky just before a storm, and she thought about a stolen kiss on a dusty street in Leavenworth, about a cutting knife in a cowboy's ribs, about a fire and a confession and a ball where she had danced with danger and kissed a man in a dark hallway despite every reason not to, about a cave in a storm and a cabin full of bullet holes and a wanted poster that had nearly broken them apart, about a ledger that had closed and a life that had opened. "Permission granted," she said. The kiss was not stolen, not desperate, not afraid. It was given by both of them in the mountain light, in the home they had built from broken things. And this time, Margaret Vance did not need the knife in her pocket.